Well, now one of the examples that I've heard was given to me was, say, alcoholism.
Uh huh.
Now, a lot of organizations apparently, if you're using, you can't participate.
Right. Right.
Or if you're, say, at a halfway house or something for drugs or
Right.
alcohol, if you're found to have been using again, you're kicked out.
You're kicked out. Right.
Is that like widespread policy?
Historically,
Tough
yes.
love. Would you call that tough love?
Well,
or what do you
yes.
call that?
Historically, people would call that tough love, and that is, and still today in certain recovery home settings, that would be the standard practice. But in Chicago, today we actually have a plan to end homelessness, and our plan
It sounds really optimistic.
Yeah, it is optimistic. It is, and it's a 10-year plan that we're in about year 8, and the idea is based on housing first. This idea that the only condition for housing should be homelessness. It shouldn't be that the person has stopped using drugs or stopped using alcohol or started to take medication for their mental illness. That homelessness is a problem that needs to be solved, and that housing is an essential piece of that solution. That as people get housed, they can become healthier. Homelessness doesn't cure addiction. It doesn't cure physical problems. In fact, it exacerbates these things.
But some people would argue that the person is homeless because they abuse drugs or alcohol or whatever. So, but you're arguing the converse.
Well, it's both and. It's both
it's
and.
a both and construct.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
I like those.
to some extent, a lot of people are homeless because they've made choices related to their drug use or their mental illness, or that's gotten them bounced out of somewhere, right? So now they're homeless. The problem is that homelessness doesn't really cure their problem. In fact, what we find is that as people who are drug users, for instance, as they become homeless, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they use more drugs.
Well, sure. That makes sense.
And that as people get housed, they use less drugs, especially when they're housed in a supportive environment. Even when they continue to be committed to using drugs, they have a little bit more room in their life to not use drugs. They aren't always running with that same crowd of drug users. They actually can retreat into this place that they have, their own home.
Not necessarily a room with a view, but still a room.
Exactly, a room, and that allows them a little bit of space where they can choose to either go out there and use or not. And the same holds true with mental illness and primary care problems. That, in our healthcare setting, people often say housing is healthcare. The idea is that, if a person has diabetes and they're on the street, managing, checking their blood sugars, managing their diet, especially managing a diet you have no control over, you're eating in shelters or food kitchens. How do you do that? Housing, like insulin or other medications, is part of the healthcare package.
But I used to live next door to this guy in Seattle. I mean, actually, he was in another part of the building, and I would hear glass breaking and stuff, and he would go off his meds. I mean, we'd find his meds out on the grass outside his window. He had a home.
Right.
Okay, devil's advocate here, but,
Good.
housing does not
right
necessarily solve the problem.
You are so right.
Because he didn't like his meds. He didn't like the side effects.
Yes, and you're so right. And so what we talk about is supported housing. So it's not just housing that's the solution, but housing with supports. And those supports include professional people who either visit this guy, like the guy you're talking about, in his apartment as often as necessary to help him,
that sounds really costly. I mean, really.
You know what's more costly?
I sound like a bureaucrat, but that sounds expensive.
It does. And you know what's more costly is if that guy is out on the street.
Breaking things
That guy
up
is out on the street, whether he's breaking things in his apartment or out on the street. Once he's breaking stuff out on the street, the police are called. The police are costly. The police take him to jail. The jail
incarceration is
very costly. There's here in Illinois, the Supportive Housing Providers Association says that supported housing costs, it costs like around $22 a day. Well, that's actually cheaper than an emergency shelter and way cheaper than jail. And shockingly cheaper than the hospital. And let's face it, that guy that you're talking about, acting out on the street, may find his way into jail, or he may find his way into a hospital.
Right.
Which is a few days in the hospital could probably pay 2 or 3 months rent for him.
Oh, easily.
Mm-hmm.
Easily.
And the salaries of the folks who would go and visit him, because they're visiting 2-3 hours a week.
Right.
And, that kind of thing.
They can monitor lots and lots of people.
But you bring up a good point. It's not just, it's housing plus supports.
Well, it sounds like there are lots of amazing resources available through the Heartland Alliance. How do people, find out, or how do you find people, or how do they find you?
Well, we find the people. Generally, the folks that we're serving usually have a very serious mental illness. A lot of times, they have an illness, say schizophrenia, for instance, and they may or may not really even believe they have that illness, or. And so what we have to do is we have to engage them through outreach. So we go comb the streets, the alleys, the park along the lakefront, and we engage people who are, dressed inappropriately for the weather. They seem to be kind of talking to someone who's not there.
And they don't have a little headpiece for their cell phone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
That throws me every day. Is that person off their meds, or do they just have an earpiece for their cell phone?
Yeah, exactly. And so we're just engaging them. We engage them in conversation, take them to McDonald's. We have a little drop-in center that we invite people to come to. Some people engage readily. Other people, it might take weeks or even months before they'll share even their name with us. But we work through outreach. We really work to kind of build that connection with them.
Is there any religious component to this?
No, not in our organization, no. That said, within the community of homeless service providers, there are some organizations that are rooted
have affiliations with. Well, if someone wants to find out, say they need possibly your services, but they don't know what services that you provide or what they can get, where can they go to find out more?
Well, the Heartland Alliance website is a good place to start, which is heartlandalliance.org.
Okay.
And the nice thing about the website is that will provide a person an overview of the entire organization, whether it's housing, healthcare, legal protections, especially for immigrants or refugees, things like this. And
now, we're presuming here that a homeless person has access to a computer so that they can go to the internet and look you guys up, right?
And often...
go to the library and do that.
And they could go to the library, or often they're working with other service providers, like at the shelter level. Other than that, we also have outreach that we do. So for the folks who really aren't even necessarily interested in coming in and interested in engaging in services, those are people who probably aren't even going to call us. They're the folks that we go out to and we meet on the streets and in the parks.
That's pretty. Chicago is a pretty brutal area in terms of weather for doing that kind of thing. So I applaud you. I'm sorry we can't talk longer. Ed Stellon of the Heartland Alliance, Director of Resource and Community Development. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I wish we could talk longer. You have been listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW, Chicago's Sound Alliance.